At dawn, beneath a heavy grey sky, rain softly drizzles over the quiet cemetery where Ethan Reynolds, a fragile 10-year-old boy, sits alone beside a modest grave marked Linda Reynolds, beloved mother. His small frame shivers in a thin jacket as he clutches a faded photograph of his mother, tears silently streaming down his cheeks, mixing with the cold drops from the sky. The earth around him is damp, and the wind cuts through the morning chill, yet Ethan remains rooted there, lost in his sorrow and longing for the mother he can no longer hold. Across the narrow path, a stranger named Daniel Harper watches from a respectful distance. Daniel is a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, his presence quiet yet attentive. He doesn't approach, instead standing still, sensing the weight of Ethan's grief and the loneliness that fills the boy's small world. Though neither speaks, the invisible thread between them begins to weave, hinting at a secret connection to the pain that lingers over the grave, a silent promise that this moment is only the beginning of a deeper story of loss, healing, and unexpected companionship. Ethan Reynolds lives with his father, Mark, in a small, aging house on the edge of a struggling neighborhood that once bustled with life but now feels worn and fragile, much like their family. Mark Reynolds, burdened by grief and exhaustion, has become a shadow of the man he once was. Since Lynn's sudden death from illness a year ago, Mark has withdrawn emotionally, drowning his sorrow in alcohol and long hours at a dead-end job. Unable to bridge the growing chasm between himself and his son, his silence fills the house, heavy and oppressive, leaving Ethan to navigate his pain largely alone. Every day, Ethan makes the quiet pilgrimage to his mother's grave, clutching her faded photo, desperate to hold on to her memory in a world where his father seems absent, both physically and emotionally. The boy's small heart aches with unanswered questions and a creeping sense of abandonment, feeling invisible in the shadows of his father's withdrawal. Nearby lives Daniel Harper, a reclusive man with kind eyes who works as a janitor at the local school. Daniel's life is marked by quiet solitude, haunted by his own past losses that have left him withdrawn and cautious. Though he keeps to himself, Daniel observes the neighborhood's slow decay and the struggles of its residents with a gentle empathy, silently wishing he could do more. The neighborhood itself feels like a character in their lives, economically strained, weathered by time and hardship, reflecting the Reynolds family's decline from once thriving to barely surviving. Within this fragile setting, Ethan's yearning for connection, for answers, and for a family that still feels whole pulses beneath the surface, setting the emotional stakes high as a boy clings to hope amid the cracks of loss and loneliness. One rainy afternoon, as the sky wept softly over the grey cemetery, Daniel Harper quietly approached Linda Reynolds' modest grave and left a small, carefully arranged bouquet of wildflowers beside the headstone. Tucked beneath the blooms was a simple note that read, "You are not alone." The gesture was gentle and unassuming, yet it carried a profound message of connection and comfort. The next day, Ethan arrived at the cemetery as usual and noticed the unexpected flowers and the note. Confused at first, his small fingers trembled as he picked up the bouquet, reading the words again and again. For the first time in months, a flicker of warmth stirred inside him, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely alone in his sorrow. When Mark found out about the mysterious bouquet, his reaction was cold and protective, laced with bitterness and fear. He warned Ethan to be wary of strangers, insisting they had to guard their grief carefully and keep their pain private. Yet, Daniel didn't stop there. Over the following days and weeks, he began leaving small, discreet gifts and handwritten notes at the cemetery for Ethan, simple tokens like a smooth stone, a worn book, a feather, each accompanied by words of empathy, encouragement, and quiet strength. These small acts of kindness began to chip away at the fortress of loneliness surrounding Ethan, offering a silent lifeline that slowly pulled him out of isolation. This inciting incident forced both Ethan and Mark to face their grief in new ways. Ethan started to feel seen and supported, while Mark grappled with the intrusion of an unknown presence into what he had believed was a private, impenetrable sorrow. The delicate balance of their lives began to shift, setting in motion a ripple of healing and confrontation that neither of them could ignore. Mark's drinking worsened with each passing day, the weight of grief and helplessness driving him deeper into despair. At home, his frustration boiled over, and he began lashing out at Ethan, accusing him of wasting time at the cemetery and talking to ghosts that weren't there. Ethan, desperate for connection, tried to reach out to his father, hoping to share the heavy burden in his heart, but Mark, ashamed and broken, recoiled, pushing his son away with sharp words and silence. Meanwhile, Daniel's quiet acts of kindness did not go unnoticed in the neighborhood. Rumors began swirling, casting suspicion on the reclusive janitor and fueling unease among neighbors who questioned his motives. At school, Ethan's pain became visible as his grades slipped and his usually bright spirit dimmed. Teachers noticed his struggle but felt powerless to intervene effectively. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Daniel confided in a trusted friend that he had once lost, a child of his own, and that helping Ethan was his way of seeking redemption and healing from his own grief. Tensions reached a boiling point when Mark confronted Daniel at the cemetery, his voice sharp and eyes filled with fury as he demanded Daniel stay away from his son and his family's pain. Ethan found himself caught painfully in the middle, torn between the angry protectiveness of his father and the gentle comfort Daniel offered in his quiet gestures. As the emotional pressure mounted, the isolation and misunderstanding between them threatened to suffocate what little hope remained, setting the stage for a reckoning none of them could avoid. The night air was heavy and cold when Mark suddenly collapsed at home, the culmination of weeks of drowning his pain in alcohol finally catching up with him. Ethan, frightened and trembling, called 911 with shaking hands, his small voice barely audible as he explained his father's condition. At the hospital, the sterile white walls and harsh fluorescent lights pressed down on the boy's shoulders. But there was no time to dwell on it. Mark was rushed into emergency care, his breathing shallow and unsteady. Ethan clung to the edges of a plastic chair in the waiting room, eyes red and raw, silently begging for a miracle. Just when hope seemed threadbare, Daniel appeared quietly beside him, the gentle man who had lingered like a quiet guardian in their lives now sat down without a word and offered a steadying presence in the chaos. For the first time in months, Ethan felt less alone. Hours later, when Mark was stable but still unconscious, Daniel stayed with Ethan, telling stories to distract him and sharing small moments of warmth that chipped away the boy's fear. When Mark finally awoke, his face pale and drawn, it was Daniel who helped him back to a fragile sense of footing. The tension that had long simmered beneath the surface, the unspoken blame, the fractured family ties, the raw grief now came rushing forth in a torrent of confession. Mark, his voice cracked with exhaustion and sorrow, admitted how deeply he had blamed himself for Linda's death, the crushing weight of the treatments they couldn't afford, the countless what-ifs that haunted every sleepless night. He had shut down, withdrawn into a fortress of pain and regret, unable to reach his son or even himself. Daniel listened without interruption, his own eyes reflecting the scars of loss that mirrored Mark's. Then, in a quiet moment that held the fragile promise of healing, Daniel revealed a truth that reshaped everything. He was not just a stranger, offering solace, but a distant relative from Linda's family, quietly watching over them all along. The revelation stunned Mark and Ethan, weaving threads of connection that had seemed forever severed. This man who had watched over their grief, left notes of comfort at the grave, and stayed by their side in the darkest hours was Family Ann, unexpected guardians sent by fate to mend what had been broken. The weight of this knowledge broke down Mark's defenses, and for the first time since Linda's passing, he allowed himself to cry openly, his tears mingling with Ethan's as they clung to each other in the sterile hospital room. It was a raw, aching release, a pouring out of years of grief and guilt that had festered in silence. Daniel's presence became a bridge, a chance for the fractured family to begin rebuilding trust, to confront their sorrow not as isolated souls but as a united, if fragile, whole. That night in the hospital, the air was thick with emotion, regret, forgiveness, hope, and the tentative stirrings of renewal. Mark apologized to Ethan for the years of absence, for the silence that had left the boy feeling so alone. Ethan, in turn, voiced his fears and loneliness, finally able to speak the pain he had buried deep inside. Daniel, with gentle words and quiet strength, promised to stand with them, not as an outsider, but as family bound by shared loss and love. Together, they began to weave a new narrative, one not defined solely by tragedy, but by the courage to face it and the determination to heal. The hospital, cold and impersonal, had become the birthplace of their fragile hope, a testament to the power of truth and connection to mend even the deepest wounds. In those quiet hours, a family, fractured but not defeated, took its first unsteady steps toward a future where grief could be met with compassion, and love, no matter how tested, could still endure. The night had crept over the Reynolds' small home like a shadow, settling thick and cold. Inside, the air was heavy with silence and the faint, acrid scent of old whiskey lingering in the corners. Mark's body finally gave way to the exhaustion he'd been ignoring for far too long, collapsing onto the worn hardwood floor with a sickening thud. Ethan's heart pounded wildly, a sudden flood of panic rising as he realized the gravity of what had just happened. His small hands fumbled to dial 911, voice cracking as he explained in urgent bursts. Time blurred into a haze of flashing lights, rushing voices, and cold, sterile halls that smelled of antiseptic and despair in the fluorescent-lit waiting room. The minutes stretched endlessly. Ethan's fingers trembled as he clutched the faded photo of his mother, the edges curling from years of being held. His eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, searched the crowd of strangers for any sign of comfort. Then, almost as if summoned by his silent plea, Daniel appeared at his presence, quiet, unassuming, but unmistakably steady. He sat beside Ethan without a word, offering a calm anchor in the storm. The boy leaned into the stranger's gentle presence, feeling a strange but welcome sense of safety, like a lifeline cast into turbulent waters. When the doctors finally emerged with cautious relief, their words of fragile promise that Mark would live, Ethan felt tears of hope prick the corners of his eyes. But the journey was far from over. In the hospital room, Mark lay pale and fragile, the weight of his sickness and shame etched deeply into every line of his face. Daniel lingered nearby, a quiet witness to the family's unraveling and a steady source of unexpected comfort. Hours passed before Mark found the courage to speak, his voice hoarse, broken by the weight of years of pain and regret. "I blamed myself, Daniel," he confessed, eyes staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers in the sterile tiles above. "I couldn't give Linda the care she needed, the treatments, the hospital bills. I wasn't enough. I wasn't there when she needed me most." The words came out in a rush, raw and ragged, a dam bursting after years of silent suffering. Daniel's eyes glistened with empathy, reflecting a shared sorrow that transcended words. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "I understand, Mark, more than you know." Then, with a pause, heavy with significance, he revealed a truth neither Mark nor Ethan had expected. "Linda was family, my cousin, distant but family all the same. I've watched over you both from afar, carrying my own grief. Losing my daughter years ago, it changed me. Helping you is how I heal. The room seemed to still, the air thick with the sudden clarity of this revelation. The invisible threads, connecting their lives, once frayed and broken, began to weave back together. Mark's eyes, heavy with exhaustion and disbelief, searched Daniel's face for proof. Ethan looked between the two men, confusion and hope mingling in his young eyes. For the first time in months, Mark let his defenses crumble. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks, mingling with Ethan's as they reached across the gulf that had separated them. "I'm sorry, son," Mark whispered hoarsely. "I should have been here for you, both of you." Ethan, voice trembling, but filled with the fierce love of a child desperate to be understood, replied, "I just wanted you to be the dad I knew before she got sick." Daniel watched silently, the weight of his own pain reflected in the quiet strength he lent them. In that hospital room, amidst the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of machines, a fragile family began to piece itself back together. They shared stories of Linda, the laughter she'd brought, the light she'd left behind, and for the first time, grief became a bridge rather than a barrier. Mark's apology was not just words, but a beginning and offering of vulnerability. Where once there was only silence and pain, Ethan found the courage to voice the loneliness he'd buried deep inside, the fear that his father might never come back from the darkness. Daniel's promise to stand with them, no longer a shadowy figure at the edges, but a part of their story, sealed the fragile hope blooming between them. The night stretched on, the hospital's cold walls bearing witness to an emotional rebirth. It was a night marked not by the absence of pain, but by the courage to face it together. They spoke of forgiveness, not as a gift to the absent or broken, but as a lifeline to themselves, way to reclaim the love that loss had threatened to erase. As dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the hospital windows, the first tentative steps of healing were taken. Mark, Ethan, and Daniel, three souls bound by grief, guilt, and love, held onto each other, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The road would be long, the scars deep, but in that quiet, raw moment, a new chapter began. A chapter where family was redefined by courage, compassion, and the unwavering human will to mend even the most shattered hearts. After the stark and shattering night at the hospital, the road to recovery stretched out before Mark like an uncertain horizon, a path both daunting and necessary. The first step was Rehab, place Mark had never imagined himself going, but now recognized as the only way to fight the demons that had slowly consumed him. His departure was quiet, marked by a reluctant farewell to Ethan and a brief, hesitant glance at Daniel, who stood silently at the doorway. A steady presence in a world that had felt unmored. Ethan watched his father leave with a cocktail of emotions: fear, hope, and a tentative thread of pride. It was the first real action Mark had taken toward healing, and though the boy's heart ached for the days when his father had been whole, he understood that sometimes healing demanded the hardest journeys. Daniel stayed close, accompanying Ethan home, his quiet words comforting like a balm to the boy's frayed nerves. "You're not alone," Daniel repeated softly, echoing the note left on Linda's grave, a phrase that had become a lifeline. At home, the silence was no longer suffocating, but filled with a cautious anticipation. Ethan began counseling sessions arranged through the school, supported by Daniel's gentle encouragement and presence. Therapy was a strange new world, filled with uncomfortable questions, moments of painful honesty, and small triumphs. The counselor's office became a refuge where Ethan learned to name his feelings: grief, anger, confusion, and ultimately, hope. Daniel often waited outside, chatting quietly with the counselor or simply sitting in the nearby cafe, ready to offer a steady hand when Ethan stepped back into the world. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's role in their lives deepened in quiet, meaningful ways. He organized a small community memorial for Linda at the local park, inviting neighbors, teachers, and friends to share stories and memories. The event was humble but powerful, a tapestry of voices weaving together laughter and tears, remembrance and celebration. For Ethan, it was the first time he felt his mother's presence wrapped around him in the embrace of a community that cared, that understood loss not as a burden but as a shared human experience. The memorial ignited a spark in Ethan. Inspired by the stories and the support, he began working on a school project dedicated to his mother's memory, a project aimed at raising awareness about families coping with loss and the quiet struggles that often go unseen. With Daniel's guidance, Ethan interviewed classmates, teachers, and community members, weaving their voices into a poignant presentation. His project became more than an assignment. It was a mission, a way to transform pain into purpose. Mark's journey through rehab was grueling. He faced his addiction head-on, confronting not only the physical withdrawal but the emotional scars beneath the guilt, shame, and sorrow that had shackled him. There were days he faltered, moments when the weight of his failures threatened to pull him under. Yet, the image of Ethan waiting for him, of Daniel's unwavering support, fueled his determination. Each therapy session, group meeting, and sober day built a foundation upon which he could slowly reconstruct his fractured self. Back home, the space between father and son began to narrow. The walls that grief and addiction had erected started to crumble under the gentle pressure of shared effort and honest conversation. Mark learned to listen, not just hear. Ethan found the courage to speak, even when words trembled with vulnerability. Their talks were often halting, punctuated by silences that once would have felt like chasms, but now became moments of quiet understanding. They navigated the delicate dance of rebuilding trusts, sometimes stepping on toes, sometimes reaching out with trembling hands, but always moving forward. Daniel's presence bridged the gaps. He was more than a mentor. He was a symbol of resilience, a living testament that family transcends biology. He taught Ethan small lessons: how to find strength in vulnerability, how to hold onto hope when the night seems endless. Together, they planted a small garden near the cemetery, a living memorial that bloomed with wildflowers each spring, a reminder of growth amid loss. As months turned into a year, the Reynolds family transformed. Linda's memory was no longer a shadow that haunted their days, but a light that guided their way. Mark remained committed to his sobriety, finding new purpose in supporting Ethan and honoring his late wife's legacy. Ethan, once a fragile boy consumed by grief, grew into a young man with quiet strength and compassion. His school project blossoming into a community initiative that helped other children and families find their voices. The neighborhood, once marked by whispered rumors and silent judgment, shifted into a place of connection and healing. Daniel's efforts to bring people together, from the memorial to volunteer programs, fostered a renewed sense of belonging. Neighbors who had turned away began to lean in, offering support not out of pity but solidarity. One late afternoon, as golden light spilled across the garden by the cemetery, Mark, Ethan, and Daniel stood side by side, watching the wildflowers sway gently in the breeze. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blossoms and the quiet hum of life continuing despite everything. Mark's hand found Ethan's, a simple gesture heavy with unspoken promises. "We carry her with us," Mark said softly, voice steady. "Not just in memories, but in who we are, in how we love, how we live." Ethan nodded, a peaceful smile touching his lips. "She's part of us, always." Daniel's eyes shone with quiet pride. "And together, you're stronger than any pain." In that moment, the past and future converged, not as opposing forces, but as parts of a whole. The healing was ongoing, imperfect, but real. The family, once fractured by loss and silence, now moved forward together carrying Linda's love as a beacon. A legacy of strength, hope, and unbreakable connection. Ethan stood quietly at his mother's grave, the fresh bouquet of wildflowers clutched gently in his hands. The rain had stopped, and a soft sun filtered through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the cemetery. This time, unlike before, his face held a gentle, hopeful smiler, fragile but real sign of healing. Beside him, Mark knelt down, his presence steady and unwavering. No words were exchanged between father and son, none were needed. Their shared silence spoke volumes, silent pact of renewed connection and love forged through pain. A short distance away, Daniel watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the journey had been long and hard, but that the family had found their way back to each other. Ethan carefully placed a handmade paper heart on the edge of the grave, his small voice barely above a whisper as he said, "We're okay now, Mum. We're coming home." The moment held a bittersweet beauty, grief still there, acknowledged and honored, but no longer a weight too heavy to bear. It was a quiet victory, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds.